I keep getting questions about whether Paul died a martyr or a natural death, and so I last covered that in 2022, and there's a little more updating I can do on that, but I want to just refresh the topic. And so this episode is entitled, Did Bishop of Rome Clement in 69 AD write a letter mentioning Paul died a natural death in Spain? And it's a very complimentary letter, so it's what you can't argue it was meant to sabotage him in some way. And all the stories we'll show you in a minute, all the stories of his death, dying in Rome, are all from the late 300s, and they're all conflicting. And even Chrysostom, who's quoting all of them, doesn't have any explanation for which one could be correct. But anyway, we'll talk about that in a second here. But this is a work that scholarship, Hoole in particular, will show you that. He dates it to 69 AD because there's still sacrifices going on in Jerusalem at this time, and the temple doesn't fall at Jerusalem until 70 AD. That puts Paul's death right around 68 AD, at least a year earlier, approximately. So here it goes, 5:5, chapter 5, verse 5 of First Clement. That's the name of the epistle, and we'll show it to you as well. Through envy, Paul, too, showed by example the prize that is given to patience. Verse 6, 7 times was he cast into chains. He was banished. He was stoned, having become a herald both in the east and in the west. He obtained the noble renown due to his faith. So you see any prejudice against him? No, it's praising him. Verse 7, and having preached righteousness to the whole world, and having come to the extremity of the west, that is Spain, most likely, meaning if you looked at the map, you'd see Spain is the west, and it's also confirmed by other sources. And having borne witness before rulers, he departed at length out of the world. That's how you talk about people who die natural deaths. He didn't say he was beheaded or anything like that. And went to the holy place, having become the greatest example of patience. So now I'm going to add something new to this episode where I'm going to show you some texts that say that Paul had reached old age, extreme old age, and it's reflected in his own epistles by the time he's leaving Rome to go through Spain. Okay? All right, and here is an email or comment from Elev 15 hours ago. So this is September 15, 2024. And he said, Paul died preaching Christ. Isn't this a good proof of his true faith? Or he was not a martyr. So which one is it? Because if he died a martyr, then clearly he was sincere. That would be the answer. Which means if he didn't die as a martyr, you might conclude he didn't necessarily die ever, having been a sincere person who was preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ at risk of being killed. Being a Roman citizen, walking around with this piece of paper you can put out and say, I'm a Roman citizen, you can't even touch me and kill me, let alone I'm exempt from a death penalty, and you can't even touch me, you can't beat me, you can't do anything. And I'm going to appeal to Caesar if you try to charge me for anything. And by doing that, he's always going to be able to zip all the way to Rome, and the witnesses won't show up, and he wins by default. I see that it's very tactical what he can do to protect himself so he never gets killed. So let's just face reality. Now, this is how I responded. Hi, Alevi. Paul, according to the Bishop of Rome, Clement, in First Clement, a work from pre-70 AD, mentioned as read in the early church, left Rome and went to Spain, the furthest west of the Roman Empire. He left Rome after the appeal was over with Nero, and he died naturally in Spain. All 4 competing and conflicting accounts of Paul dying at Rome alongside Peter are from the 400, late 300s, or later period. Moreover, Clement was the Bishop of Rome, and had Paul died in Rome, a martyr, who better to know that fact than the Bishop of Rome? In other words, since the Bishop of Rome says Paul died in Spain, obviously there's 4 stories that are conflicting from the late 300s that Paul died a martyr with Nero are completely impossible because he wasn't there. He was in Spain, and the Bishop of Rome, Clement, would know better than anyone that Paul wasn't there in Rome for death, because he didn't die where Clement was the bishop. So here is First Clement. So this is the reading. And I think I've already read this. I don't need to read it again. You already got it. So he went into the west. He obtained his noble renown to his death, having preached righteousness to the world, and having come to the extremity of the west, meaning Spain, and having borne witness before rulers, he departed at length out of the world and went to the holy place. Just the way you would talk about it, dearly departed. He departed out of this world and went to heaven, if that's what you believe, right? In Acts, Paul was heading to Rome to hear Paul's appeal to Magistrate Festus in Caesarea to Nero, a right Paul had as a Roman citizen. So just to back up to the audience at large here is that Luke is writing to Most Excellent Theophilus the way you would address a magistrate judge who assists Nero on every appeal he does. So Paul when you're looking at the book of Acts, I need to look at the very end. He's waiting for an appeal to be heard by Nero in Rome. So the answer to why Luke is even writing Acts to Theophilus, and before that he wrote the book of Luke to most excellent Theophilus. Why is he doing that? He's doing it for an upcoming appeal. He's trying to win over the pagan ruler Nero through his pagan magistrate. It's obvious he's not a Christian. He's just being called most excellent out of respect for his position. And that means that Paul, when the book of Acts ends, has 2 years for that appeal. And then we have to find out, did he win that appeal or not? And I think a lot of people assume he lost the appeal because the dating doesn't allow for him to be released and then get martyred again in Rome some later time, because there's just not enough time to squeeze that in. But let's just read here. So the answer to, did he get convicted in that appeal? The answer is no. Eusebius and Jerome both record that Paul was acquitted by Nero in this trial or in this appeal. Eusebius makes it emphatic that Paul was, quote, absolved of all crime. Eusebius, Ecclesiastical History, 325 AD, 1905 edition, to page 62. It's also referenced as Book 2, Chapter 12. So this is the path that, according to the Muroran Canon, that led Paul to return via Spain and, quote, depart at length from this world, as 1 Clement 5, verse 5 to 6 records. Now let's look at the Muroran Canon, and because this is a concurrent corroboration of what happened with Paul. The Muroran Canon scrap from, and some scholars contend it's 2nd or 4th century, but the scholar who prepared this work down here says it's from the 8th century. In the Ambrosian Library in Milan, it was found. Probably written in Bobbio. Okay, so let's call it 8th century. The Muroran scrap is written there, but the chronological date of what was on the document is concluded paleographically to be either 2nd or 4th century. Okay, I'm pretty sure that's exactly right. So let's see. So the Muroran Canon scrap from the 2nd or 4th century records a trip by Paul from Rome, as Clement says, to Spain, which is never mentioned in Acts. Of course it wouldn't be, because Acts ends 2 years before the appeal. The whole point of it is to get it in time, give it to Theophilus in adequate time for him to process it, and then prepare Nero for the appellate decision, which we've already seen that Eusebius and Jerome both say Paul won that, so he was acquitted. So this says, it says, Paul, who from the city of Rome proceeded to Spain. So this is the next leg that you need to get. Where did he go? He went from Rome to Spain, and this is recorded in the Muroran Canon, which incidentally is trying to list those things that are to be read in church. So it's important that it's reciting for the benefit of the reader of this document that Paul went from Rome. He was acquitted. So this is consistent with what Eusebius and Jerome had said. Paul was acquitted, and then he goes to Spain. Do you see how all these things corroborate each other? Okay. So then we go to an article called Development of the Canon of the New Testament, and go to the article on Muroran Canon. This is the web page link. And I'm going to read to you the most pertinent thing here, so we don't need these words here, but it begins with this sentence. For the most excellent Theophilus, Luke summarizes the several things that in his own presence have come to pass. I'm going to pause there. So that's a key fact there, is Luke makes it very clear he's not writing under inspiration. We have to be clear what he's saying. I'm writing to you, most excellent Theophilus. This is the opening of Luke, chapter 1, verses 1 to 3. And I have used the most reliable witnesses, and I've done a careful examination of the evidence. And here's, basically what I think is true. And the scholarship has documented that Luke is actually translating the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew that was written according to top scholars. And Jerome had no dispute about this when he was there. He actually saw the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew in 388 AD. The consensus was that it was written about 4 years after the crucifixion and ascension of Jesus, because it's in Hebrew. And so that was the fastest thing to write in, because Matthew was writing it, and he knew Hebrew. And that would be the language that would normally be used, or an Aramaic version of Hebrew. Anyway, so it reads this way, the Muroran Canon. For the most excellent Theophilus, Luke summarizes several things that in his own presence have come to pass, just like Luke says in Luke 1, 1 to 3. As also by the omission of the passion of Peter, he makes quite clear. So what I think I think what he's saying here is that it omits the death of Peter by martyrdom, therefore it hadn't yet come to pass, and equally by the omission of the journey of Paul, who from the city of Rome proceeded to Spain. So what he's saying is, we know that these things hadn't yet happened, or at least Luke did not know that Peter had been martyred, and did not know yet that Paul had traveled from Rome to Spain. The epistles, however, of Paul themselves make clear to those who wish to know it, which they are, and that is from Paul, and from what place and for what cause they were written. So there is nothing about a martyrdom of Paul, and it just leaves it right there. Who had the passion? Even the Muroran Canon is telling you Peter had the passion. He's the one who was martyred, but not Paul. Paul just simply went from Rome to Spain. You see how this all fits together? So the first letter of Clement fits in with the Muroran Canon. And then I mentioned to this person, I said, incidentally, the Muroran Canon endorses the Jesus words only principle as the rule. Now, that's so interesting, isn't it? Then Paul wrote to the Romans, to whom he explains that Christ is the rule of the scriptures, and moreover, their principle. He has written this at considerable length. So he's saying that Christ is the rule of the scriptures, and moreover, their principles. So Jesus is the principle of all scriptures, and that's it. So not individuals who are writing letters and commentary, but those words of Jesus. That's the rule to follow. And just if you wanted to know the exact words that I got from the article, it's right here. And then to the Romans, to whom he explains that Christ is the rule of scriptures, and moreover, their principle. Next, the fabrications of Paul dying in Rome began in about 398. Which Chrysostom does not hesitate to be the first to record for 4 contradictory accounts. And so first, this is from the works of Nathaniel Larder, 5 volumes. By the way, a fantastic resource because he actually does studious work on a lot of different things. So I recommend people get this and read it. And I'm going to be making it available in my public domain list as I get them processed, and they'll go up into that list. If you have that list or that URL, you'll find the link to download these things, and I highly recommend it. So 1815 work, volume 2, and he records, Chrysostom in 398 says Paul was set at liberty at Rome, and then, quote, went into Spain. So even Chrysostom has it. So now you have the Muroran Canon, you have Chrysostom saying the same thing. But then here's where the first myth of Paul dying in Rome as a martyr is mentioned by Chrysostom, but he's going to mention several others soon in a minute. And then Paul came to Jerusalem and made a visit to Jewish believers there, and then he came to Rome where he was put to death by Nero. Okay, so that's at page 607 of volume 2. But if you keep reading, you'll get more. All right, so we're continuing to rely upon Larder, volume 2, 1815, and I have a lot to show you from that still. That's very important, new information. And he says, here's the other accounts that Chrysostom gives, that Nero put Paul to death because he had converted a beloved concubine of the emperor, which story I do not think to be well attested. So Larder is not agreeing that it's probably confirmed. Chrysostom also informs us that it was said that Paul saluted the butler or cupbearer and a concubine of Nero. These are all different explanations. It's good. One says a butler, another says a cupbearer, another says a concubine. So there's really now 4 different stories. Chrysostom supposes in another place that his converting Nero's cupbearer was the immediate occasion of his death. So out of these 3 latter explanations, he puts more weight on the cupbearer example as the immediate cause of death. He likewise speaks of Nero's being offended because the apostle found favor with one of the emperor's friends. So that might suggest that it's the concubine or so on, or the butler or something. So the point is, there's 4 stories of Paul's death by Nero, doing it for 4 different reasons. And that means that none of these are consistent. And when you see 4 different accounts, it means people are making stuff up. And that's what has to be, because you can see from First Clement, he's already been dead in before 69 AD approximately. So let's go back, and I want to show you a few things. This is very interesting that Larder provides us this information, and this is page 606. And what I'm going to focus in on is that he says here, the epistles to Philemon likewise is a late epistle, for the apostle was then arrived to extreme old age, and he refers to verse 9. So verse 9 of Philemon, or Philemon, is how you deduce that Paul had reached an extreme old age. Now, Now, let's read this whole thing. Chrysostom published homilies or commentaries on St. Paul's 14 epistles, which are still extant. In the proem to his homilies upon the epistles of the Romans, he speaks of the time of several of them, which I refer the reader. However, I shall observe here several particulars as briefly as I can. Now, this is Larder, a very scholarly person, good Christian guy too, I think. He says that the epistle to the Romans, though placed first, was not the first in order of time. So you need to know the epistles have been rearranged inside of our New Testament to put up front the one that is least scary, frightening when you read it. If I put Galatians up there first, most Christians would probably never keep reading. That's what I think you should know. But anyway, there was a reason, a tactical reason to put that first. But not till after several others. For both the epistles to the Corinthians were written before it, the book of the Romans, and the first epistle to the Thessalonians was written before either of those to the Corinthians. So the first epistles were actually Thessalonians. Okay, so they were dated, now current scholars would say, to 51, 52 AD. Paul, remember, he had his road to Damascus experience in 36 AD. He spends 14 years in Arabia, and he basically has no output production of any letters until Thessalonians in 51, 52 AD, which means he did nothing along those lines of advancing his message, if he had one, until 15 years later. But if you read Thessalonians, it's very normative. It sounds just like, Jesus teaching repentance. And if you reject the duty of repentance, you are rejecting not me, you're rejecting God who gave you the Holy Spirit. That's what he says in First Thessalonians 4. So very normative, very strange in hindsight that he could say that then and then take it all back about 5 years later when he writes Galatians and First Corinthians. So let's keep going. To the Philippians, he wrote from Rome. So now this is interesting, Larder's telling you what letters Paul's writing when he's there in Rome on that appeal. He's waiting for 2 years to get that appeal heard. To the Hebrews, likewise, he wrote from them. So Lardner is accepting that Hebrews were written by Paul, which is now highly disputed and probably never going to be accepted ever again is from Paul. It's likely from Barnabas, by the way. The epistle to Timothy, meaning the second, was also written from Rome. So now you have Philippians written from Rome. You have that the epistle to Timothy, number 2, second epistle is written from Rome when the apostle was a prisoner there. And it seems to him to be the last of all of Paul's epistles. The epistle to Philemon or Philemon, likewise, is a late epistle, for the apostle was then arrived to extreme old age, referring to verse 9. This is why, in particular, I want to read this to you. But I think it's also useful to see that everything is consistent, that Paul's writing output improves when he's in prison. When he's in jail, he writes Galatians probably, and when 1st and 2nd Corinthians, these are all likely happening while he's in prison, and having imprisonment in Caesarea with Festus. Then, as he gets closer, he's writing, when he's at Rome, all these pastoral type epistles. Nevertheless, it was written before the epistle to the Colossians, as appeared from the end of that epistle. See Colossians 4, verses 7 to 9. I likewise, this is Lardner speaking, I likewise think, says he, no, I guess he's saying it's Chrysostom, that the epistle of the Galatians was written before that to the Romans. Well, yes. So writes Chrysostom in the proem to his homilies upon the epistle to the Romans. So there's where you get this deliberate manipulation by putting Romans, which seems very benign in many places. I mean, in fact, take a look at the Romans 2, chapter 2, verse, I think it's 4 to 7 in there. Paul says the way to have eternal life is to do good works, or is unto eternal life. Very normative, right? What's that about? He takes it all back in Romans 4, but that's still, what a strange thing to find something like that right up front in the book of Romans. Sounds a lot like the old Paul back in Thessalonians' day, but it isn't. He changes by the time he gets to Romans 4. So writes Chrysostom in the proem. Okay, now let's continue. Now, what I really like is you're going to see again and again a reference to Paul, things being short time near his death, his physical nature is near his end. So this is all happening at Rome. He's living in Rome, waiting for the appeal, and he's nearing his end. He's in extreme old age, and so everything fits and makes sense that when he gets to Spain, he dies a natural death. It's all this. The writing is on the wall. So let's listen to this section, because again, this is Lardner. And he's extremely studious, and he puts a lot of things together in a very tight space, which all relate to each other. I mean, this is the way good writing should be done. In the argument of the epistle to the Ephesians, he says it was written from Rome. So this is again going back to the same theme he was showing you over here. All the things that came from Rome. Here are 3 from Rome and 1 old age reference. See, so I'm trying to show you. Paul's output goes way up when he's sitting there imprisoned at Rome. So Ephesians is written from Rome when Paul was a prisoner here. In the preface to the Epistle to the Philippians, he says the apostle was then a prisoner at Rome. So Ephesians is written at Rome. Philippians is written at Rome. In the first homily upon the Epistle to the Colossians, he says the Epistle and the Epistle of Ephesians and to Philemon or Philemon and to Timothy were written when the apostle was in bonds. Again, that means he's a prisoner. So why is he a prisoner? Because he's at Rome. So all these things, Ephesians, Philemon, or Philemon, Timothy, Colossians, are all written while he's at Rome. I mean, his output goes through the roof when he's at Rome. From the inscription of the epistle to the Colossians, he concludes that Timothy was known to the saints at Colossae. In the first homily upon the second epistle to Timothy, he says again, he thinks that the apostle was then near his end. He's about to die. So makes perfect sense. When the appeal happens, Paul takes a trip to Spain and he just dies a natural death. He departs out of the world. Makes perfect sense. So you see now, this is the evidence I didn't provide in prior episodes about this from 2022. So this is new evidence I've obtained since then. In another homily upon the same epistle, he says it was full of consolation and a sort of testament. So like your last will and testament. So Paul is contemplating his own death, and he's speaking like it's a testament. He's giving away stuff, and as I recollect. In his first homily upon the epistle to Titus, he says that probably Titus was a Corinthian, and Paul was at liberty at the time of writing that epistle. So maybe what's happened is the epistle to Titus has to be the last thing. He's been released. He's on his way to Spain, and now he's writing a letter to Titus. And Paul was at liberty at the time of the writing of that epistle, and it was written before the second epistle to Timothy. And he observes that Paul had determined to winter at Nicopolis, a city of Thrace. So Paul had made that trip, or excuse me, he intended to make a trip, but he apparently didn't do that. He went straight to Spain. But maybe he did go to Thrace, and then he went to Spain. We don't have all the details of that, but we know, according to Clement, he dies in Spain. He departs naturally out of the world. Lastly, I want to show you how reliable First Clement is because of its date. When was it written? And it's also fully known. His full name is First Clement to the Corinthians. And when you go to early Christian writings, it'll give you some commentary. Alvar Ellegard has argued for a date as early as the 60s of the first century for a few reasons in his work, Jesus. The temple cult is mentioned in the present tense, pages 38 and 39. I'm going to show you that so that there is no real dispute. Peter and Paul are mentioned as of our generation at pages 39 and 40 of this book by Ellegard, but I'm going to show it to you myself. The first proof on this point about the dating comes from the earliest contemporaries account of Paul's last days. This was written by Clement, Bishop of Rome, probably shortly before 70 AD, as he mentions that sacrifices were continuing at the temple. That's at First Clement to the Corinthians, 17, verse 20. And we're going to show that to you now. So here's First Clement to the Corinthians. Clement was a disciple of Peter and afterwards Bishop of Rome. Chapter 17, and he writes this verse 20, the daily sacrifices are not offered everywhere, nor the peace offerings, nor the sacrifices appointed for sins and transgressions, but only at Jerusalem. Under the law, the Torah is very clear. There's only one place you can do sacrifices, only at the temple of Jerusalem. So all other temples had to be destroyed or banned or prohibited, and the Romans didn't like that because they want to sacrifice their meat to idols on a regular basis. That's how they operate throughout the entire empire. But here they're being told by the Jews, you can't even have a temple to sacrifice. So this was a big issue of contention between the Romans and the people of Israel. But I digress. But only at Jerusalem, nor in any place there, but only at the altar before the temple. So you couldn't do it just anywhere in the temple. Like, we have like 10 stations. No, it had to be at the altar. It's called the sacrifice altar. That which is offered being first diligently examined by the high priest and the other ministers beforehand. So that's proof positive that he's writing while this is still going on. Why would he go to this great detail to tell you all that? And that is in this work called the Apocryphal New Testament, being all the Gospels, etc., 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 1849. Okay. Now, I've already read you the passage from Hoole. So the quote I gave you of the uh, natural death of Paul came out of this work from Charles Hoole, 1885, and it's right here. Okay. Anyway, so you can see that in if obviously Clement is writing before 70 AD. 70 AD is when the temple is destroyed by the Roman armies. Therefore, there could be no more sacrifices after 70. So he had to be writing before 70. So the scholars have designated 69 AD, as I showed you earlier in Larder's quotes, as the likely date of First Clement. So that's it. All right. So I think we've covered the issue that was posed by a levy 15 hours ago had said Paul died preaching Christ. And the answer is no, he did not die preaching Christ. He died a natural death on his deathbed. Isn't this a good proof of his true faith? No, you don't have any evidence of that. And the evidence stacks up completely the opposite. He died a natural death in Spain. And it's foreshadowed by Paul's own handwriting in multiple letters that he was nearing death. And he was fearing death. And he was making a testament in various epistles as if he knows he's going to die soon. And so that's why Paul's own words are the proof that he was near death. And there was no evidence of any claim that anybody made that Paul died a martyr until 390s. And there were 4 different accounts that all conflict with each other, as we mentioned earlier. So he did not die as a martyr. And so whatever that value you think of that argument provides you, you don't have it. All right. God bless everybody. Ciao. Bye.